Good evening. I'd like to talk about the MBTI tool and kind of how to identify your type. Through the course of this last week, what I've really discovered about MBTI and Myers-Briggs is so much more than what I had anticipated. What I originally had thought was, in order to determine your dominant function, it was the function that was most prominent, the function that you used the most. And this has come to the conclusion that, for me at least, that this is not necessarily true. What the dominant function is and what the belief of Myers-Briggs is that we are born with an innate preference for certain things, how we judge and make decisions and how we perceive and process information. And the functions we use to judge are thinking and feeling, and the functions that we use to perceive and perception functions are sensing and intuition. The misconception is that we use all thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition. Everybody does. And it's just the order in which we preference these functions. The key is to understand that Myers-Briggs does not indicate a strengthened function. So what that means is that you may have somebody who has a dominant function that could be weak. So let's say an INTP who doesn't use their thinking function very well. They still use it, obviously it's their preference, but it hasn't been developed for whatever reason. So the Myers-Briggs character code, rather the letters, the indicator, is your introductory, the very first letter, is the way, your attitude toward how you get your energy. It's an attitude. So do you get your energy from the external world or do you get your energy from the internal world? And extroversion has many facets to it. So does introversion. Both have many facets. So what that means is you can have certain traits that are extroverted and certain traits that are introverted. So it's hard to determine, am I really an extrovert or am I really an introvert? So the best way to identify your type is to actually take the instrument. The instrument is designed to help you find your overall preference by working with a professional. It's not the instrument in itself, but the professional that's able to help walk you through a process that allows you to determine whether you are lean toward extroversion or you lean toward introversion. The expert's design is, the certified practitioner is going to help walk you through that process by asking a series of questions that are personalized to your experience. One thing about the instrument that a lot of people make a mistake on is they answer the questions in the instrument based on the way they have to be versus what they prefer. So the one question that we learn to ask to get people in the mindset of taking the instrument accurately is, if you had no one or nothing to answer to, what would be your natural preference? What would you prefer? Not what you've learned to do. So let me put this another way. Any type, that is ENTJ, that is INFP, that is ISFP, the two types that are typically seen as illogical or incapable of doing high-level logical structure and order and systems. That's how we've stereotyped those types. Essentially, those types are very capable and just as capable as any other type in doing work, any type of work, using any of the functions. The strength of their functions can be developed. That's the purpose of the instrument, is to kind of point you in the direction of what areas that you need to develop in, how to develop your non-preferred functions. So the key to leadership is not being a certain type, but it's actually being a type, any type, that learns how to, what we call, flex into the non-preferred functions and use non-preferred functions to communicate to people who prefer those functions or to make decisions with people who also prefer the opposing functions or your non-preferred functions. That's what makes a good leader. It's not, hey, I'm an INTJ, so I'm a better leader than you, or I see a bigger picture than you, because the MBTI does not measure strength in any trait. It's not a trait-based tool. It's specifically designed to give you an understanding of your personal preferences in an innate state. That's the step one part of the MBTI. MBTI also offers a step two instrument. And the step two instrument actually breaks down each dichotomy. That's introversion versus extroversion, sensing versus intuition, that is your thinking versus feeling, and judging versus perceiving. So let me go back into the dichotomies real quick so everybody has a firm understanding of this. Extroversion and introversion. There's no such thing as an extrovert or an introvert. It is what your overall preference is. You may have some facets of introversion and you may have some facets of extroversion, but what the overall preference is how the practitioner is going to help work through that with you to determine what your overall preference is. So you can't just look at somebody and type them. It's impossible. And I say this because you don't know if someone is extroverted or introverted. How are they getting their energy unless you ask questions? But just looking at somebody and seeing how they behave in the extroverted world, that's not a good way to do it. Let me put it this way. As I move through these dichotomies, you'll see in a better sense. So the second letter in the dichotomy chain or the character code is going to be the way you perceive information. It's either going to be an S or an N. The first letters are E or I. Second letter, S, N. What that indicates is if you have a preference for sensing or a preference for intuition. It doesn't mean I'm a strong intuitive or I'm a weak intuitive or I'm a strong sensor or I'm a weak sensor. What it means is I have a natural preference for this perceiving function. The third function, which is T or F, okay, that is how you make decisions, okay? Either you have a preference for thinking, which is not thinking in general, but more of the use of logic, or you have a preference for feeling, which is essentially more of a compassionate, connecting type of thing about people. So logic or people, how do you make your decisions? Okay, again, each one of these has a facet. And the last character code, probably the most complicated one to explain, but it's your attitude toward the outer world. So it's a J versus P. Do you tend to structure or organize the outer world, or do you tend to explore the outer world with a perceiving function? The judging means structure and order. Now, we all share a little bit of both, generally speaking. A lot of people have judging preferences, a lot of people have perceiving preferences. Some of us are natural perceivers who have learned to judge because of our jobs, because of our families. We have learned to become judgers. In this regard, society promotes the ideal type to work in the American workforce as ESTJ. What that means is ESTJs are the typical society epitome and pillar of society. What that means is, in a sense, it doesn't mean they're better than any other type. It's just what society promotes more. So people naturally learn the facets of E, learn the facets of S, learn the facets of T, and learn the facets of J. They feel like almost forced to learn those facets. In other words, any type can start looking like an ESTJ should they practice and work with their non-preferred functions. Okay? Again, your career, any type can excel in any career. They're going to have to develop different parts of their non-preferred functions, but they can still develop in those careers. Their natural attraction to those careers, however, may be different. Hence why generally you're going to see in upper level management people who have an STJ code or a NTJ code in their suffix of their character code. We'll get into that later, but ultimately what I'm getting at is here that society has a very stipulation of to what somebody in the American workforce should look like, or a workforce in general, STJ, okay? And the preference of extroversion over introversion. So people tend to move toward ESTJ. So a lot of people can look like an ESTJ because they've developed those non-preferred functions. So the instrument is not about what you become because of your work conditions, your family life, or whatever, but it's your natural preference if you didn't have to go to work, or if you enjoy work, maybe that's your natural preference. If you love what you do, that might be your natural preference. Look out for words like I have to and I should. If you say those things, it doesn't sound like a preference. It sounds like something you feel like you're almost being forced to do. So if you say, man, I have to make schedules every day. Maybe you prefer a facet of P over J. The instrument's designed to help you identify those things, and then as the expert walks you through those things and identifying those facets. And so that's the idea of the Step 2 test, is to break each dichotomy down, E versus I, S versus T, S versus N, T versus F, and J versus P. Let's talk a little more about J versus P. This is your attitude toward the extroverted world, or rather the outer world. So someone who has a perceiving or a P letter in their character code, let's take INTP for example, they are very focused on exploration. That's the side they extrovert, okay? So really speaking, an INTP, what a person's going to see is the side that the INTP is extroverting. So if I look at an INTP, what I'm going to see is their first extroverted function. the psyche is made up of 4 functions according to MBTI. Your dominant function, your auxiliary function, your tertiary function, and your inferior function. After these functions, okay, these are your cognitive functions. There's 4 functions. There is intuition, sensing, those are your perception functions, and then there's thinking and feeling. Those are your judgment functions. Those functions have attitudes generally, which means extroverted or introverted. You can have extroverted thinking versus introverted thinking. That's another topic for another time. Let's just keep it at 4. Sensing, intuition, thinking, and feeling. And those functions are what your natural preference is. So, an INTP, if you understand stacks, which we'll get into later as well, is an INTP is a dominant thinker. That's their first function, is they refer to thinking. That's their number 1 function. That is their natural first preference, is thinking. They prefer thinking over everything else. They prefer thinking over perception. They prefer thinking over sensing, intuition, inside perception. And they prefer thinking over feeling. Okay? But here's the trick. The reason why they're a P-type, even though thinking is a judgment function, is because their thinking is directed inward. It's an introverted thinking. So, the next function, the auxiliary function, is going to be a perception function for an INTP. And that is going to be the function that the extrovert. In this case, it's going to be intuition for an INTP. So, therefore, the P represents the first extroverted function, and therefore the world will see an INTP as an explorer, a perceiver, a person who's asking questions, a person who's reaching out. Okay? One last thing I want to eliminate with these biases is that I want to eliminate the idea that I can't be a INTP because I have this facet. Each dichotomy has a lot of different facets. I'm not saying 5, I'm not saying 10. There could be 40 different facets of extroversion. Just because you like to spend time alone doesn't mean you're an introvert. Just because you don't like parties doesn't mean you're an introvert. There's no such thing as an introvert or extrovert. You're looking for an overall preference and understanding the facets that make up that preference for introversion or extroversion. Okay? So that's the angle I want you to understand, is that just because you're missing a quality out of a type description, it doesn't mean that you're not that type. What it's indicating is that you may have a facet in that overall preference that what we call out of preference. So if you type as an overall introvert, rather you prefer introversion over extroversion, but you have an extroverted facet, then you will have an out of preference facet. Here's an example. Let's say you preference introversion overall. That's your overall preference, is introversion. Yet, you love to introduce people to people. Let's say that you love to go out and actually introduce people to each other. That's a passion of yours, or you enjoy doing that. But yet, at the end of the day, you may go home and just say, I need to get away from people for a while. And then I prefer to reflect on things, and I prefer to be quiet for the most part. I do that. I love doing that, but it wears me out. Maybe you have an overall preference for introversion with that extroversion facet called initiating. Those are some examples of what we can't stereotype as, I can't be an INTP because I do that. INTPs don't do that. That's not what you want to get. That's not what I'm getting at here. You have to understand each facet. What makes you you? This is what takes Myers-Briggs from 1 out of 16 boxes and really puts it into 1 out of 1 million, or 1 out of 3 million, or 1 out of 5 million, depending on how you use your facets. And so that's the idea that you really want to take home with Myers-Briggs. It's not an indicator of strengths. It doesn't determine how well and how strong your strengths are. It's not Strengths Finder. It's not saying, okay, your intuition is your strongest strength. It's an order of preferences. It's about what you naturally preference over other functions. Some people may believe that, nature versus nurture, you can change your natural preferences. According to MBTI, you cannot, okay? It doesn't mean that that's necessarily true. I can say that MBTI has nearly or approximately 70 years of research indicating that it is true, but again, it may not be. So if you don't agree with that, that's okay. But MBTI is based on the understanding that we all have natural preferences and our overall type will never change. What does change is the strength of each function. As I move through life, I've learned to work more in a sensing-oriented world, so I've developed skills in sensing, but my natural preference is intuition. If I were to take out everything that I do in a day, I would prefer intuition 100%, but yet I live in a sensing style manner because that's what works in the workforce. So it's really important to understand that you can develop functions, but again, my natural preference won't change. It's who I am. So at the end of the day, I want you to take home that to identify your type, you need to work with a professional. You need to work with somebody who can kind of coach you with that. Or you can just study enough and you really can just connect to a type and say, you know what, that is me. Because at the end of the day, the professional doesn't decide your type. The instrument doesn't decide your type. You decide your type. Okay? Even the professional will say, hey, you reported this, but based on this, does this sound like you? And if it doesn't, we'll work with you. We'll try to figure out what we can do to help you identify your type and then help you make that final decision, what we call a verified type or your best fit type. Okay, so we use the report as a way to point you in the right direction, but we can say, you know, this may not fit you. And if it didn't, why'd you answer the questions that way? And what would fit you better? And then we'd look at other types and see. We'd explore. We'd find out what works for you. So what you're paying for is not some silly test. It's not an online test. It's a test that validates, it's an indicator that shows you what direction we should go to be able to help you identify what you relate to most and then show you how to develop maybe potential blind spots and your overall type preference. With that being said, I just want to finish this off with one thing. MBTI is based on tons of validity studies, internal consistency studies, and reliability studies in many different countries. I think it's over 25 now. And it's not just some theory. It's been tested over and over and over again. And we shoot for an over 80% reliability. So it's still being improved. It's not a perfect instrument, but it is still being improved. And every year they're running more and more studies. I encourage you to look into it. It is absolutely an amazing tool to help you identify your type and then help you develop potential blind spots that you may have not even been aware of. If you have an overall preference for INTP, you can have weak thinking. You may have overdeveloped feeling. You may have underdeveloped intuition. You may have overdeveloped sensing. But at the end of the day, you're still an INTP because that's what you naturally prefer. But maybe somebody in your life told you, you know what, stop thinking so much and start doing, or whatever else they may, you know, maybe they said, pay attention to details, pay attention to details, pay attention to details. And yet you hated it, but you learned how to do it. So you developed your sensing over intuition. So you may type as something else. You may type as an ISTP because you're like, you know what, I definitely prefer sensing over, you know, intuition. But at the end of the day, you still preference that intuition overall. So I want you to take that home and understand that there is a ton of research and white papers on MBTI, and it's not, and it doesn't put you in a box if you understand that it's about preferences and not about this is a box, but what you naturally prefer, and then the facets of that overall preference. So it's almost crazy to say that all ENTJs initiate. All ENTJs are gregarious. All ENTJs are, you know, active. All ENTJs are enthusiastic. All INTPs are introverts. They preference introvert overall, but they have extroverted facets too. Just to let you know. Anyway, I hope that sums it up, and I tried to be as clear as possible. Again, I ad-libbed this, so I do hope that clears some things up, and I hope that helps people introduce you to type and typology and a lot of the theory behind it. I can get into type dynamics, but I want to try to keep this as simple as possible. I hope that lays things out, and I hope you all understand that it is an absolutely great tool to use, and it's not an end all, but it is certainly a great tool to help you develop your ability to communicate to other preferences, your ability to understand other people, stress management, career counseling. It's used in many different organizations, and it's the #1 tool used in the world for personality typing. So anyway, that wraps it up, and I appreciate you guys' time. I know this is probably a long video, but I appreciate you guys' time, and thanks for watching. We'll see you later.